what choices do we make in our lives when we encounter discrimination, when we encounter someone who is being, bullied, when we encounter injustice?
Not many people know of the Shanghai Jewish refugees.
It's not only my story, it's my mother's. She's the reason I'm alive today. My name is Harry J. Abraham. I was born on March 15th, 1938. I am one of about 20,000 Jews who were able to escape from the Nazis to Shanghai, China. This was thanks to my mother. She's the one that helped our family leave Germany after Kristallnacht.
I would like to know how you became interested as a scholar in the Shanghai Landers.
I became interested because I was going to direct a residential program in Hangzhou for Valparaiso University. And knowing that I was going to be doing that, I started looking in German archives for materials that would link German and Chinese history. And I stumbled upon a large file pertaining to refugees who had lived in Shanghai, had gone to the United States in 1950 and were not allowed to stay in the United States. So they arrived in San Francisco, were put immediately on a train that sent them to New York. They were put on Ellis Island, and there they waited to see if they would be accepted. They were not, and they were sent actually to Germany and wound up in Bremen. And so I was looking at the files pertaining to this group of 106 refugees who had been, as you can imagine, through quite a bit and did not want to be where they were and wanted to go to the United States, back to the United States. So I found this to be a fascinating history, but I realized that I was only seeing the tip of the iceberg, really, in terms of this more rich history. So I started to then do more research on the Jews in Shanghai itself, and then started to conduct interviews. And I have been conducting interviews ever since, all over, wherever people are who are willing to share their story. I go and then interview them to preserve their story, but then also to try to get their story to young people so that young people can learn about this very little known history.
November 9th, 1938, Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. In the little town that I was born in, Frickhofen, which is about 60 kilometers from Frankfurt, the Nazis threw bricks through all the windows. As I've been told, I lay beneath the window in the first house they attacked, and glass shattered all over me. My mother was there with me, and she picked me up, and luckily the glass didn't hurt me.
So I'd like to know what caused the immigration of so many Jews to Shanghai at that time.
Well, the first immediate cause was the persecution in Nazi Europe, starting primarily with Kristallnacht of November of 1938. Of course, persecution had happened before that time, but most Jews in Germany and Austria really felt that that they didn't have to leave, that maybe Hitler was a passing phase, that he would go away. Plus, this was their home, so it takes a lot to have people leave the place that they feel is their home. But things with Kristallnacht became so problematic for the Jews, Jews being rounded up, put into concentration camps, that now people seriously were thinking they needed to get out.
To clarify, Kristallnacht was a planned attack on all Jews by the Nazi regime?
Yes. In fact, Hitler ordered that stormtroopers attack in towns they didn't live in. Most Nazis had grown up with the Jews, and he didn't want them to hesitate. He didn't want them to have that emotional connection.
And what about your father?
My father was a middleman who bought and sold cows. He was in the town that he was born in, Altenkirchen. And that night, about 20 kilometers from my town, all the Jewish people, including my father, were taken to the Marktplatz, the center of the town. My uncle, Siegfried, was arrested in Frickhofen, and they were both taken to Buchenwald.
A concentration camp, correct?
Yes, the concentration camp.
What was it like?
Well, I wasn't there, but I've been told that Buchenwald was a dirty, terrible place with, at the time, 40,000 prisoners. It was a big place, absolutely empty and surrounded by wire fences and watchtowers. I was told also during the first weeks of its opening, 7 people tried to escape. They were caught by Nazi soldiers and shot. Can you believe that? 7 innocent people killed just like that. They only wanted freedom. We only wanted freedom.
The second part, which is, I think, much less known, and is especially, I think, surprising to young people. I know it's surprising to students that I've had in the United States, which is that when the Jews were looking for a place to go, they couldn't find any place that would have them. And that includes the United States, where quotas were set and then obstacles were put in place to try to prevent Jews from arriving. So Shanghai was not definitely the destination of choice, but it became the destination of basically of opportunity. So where you have the persecution in Nazi Europe, but then also the closed doors, the bureaucratic paper walls that prevented Jews from going elsewhere, the choice became ultimately Shanghai.
Now tell me, why do you think the Chinese actually welcomed the Jews when all the other countries of the world closed their doors, with the exception of the Dominican Republic, as I understand,
Yes.
and China? Why did China welcome the Jews?
It's a complicated story that involves Japanese occupation and also the kind of strange dynamic within Shanghai itself, which was opened up forcibly after the Opium Wars in the 19th century. And European powers set up shop, and they actually divided the city. So the city was not under Chinese control. And really, it boiled down to who had control of the port. And that was from 1937 in Shanghai, really the Japanese, who had control of the harbor. And although it's interesting, the Americans and the British who were in Shanghai were not open to this influx of refugees. And actually the Shanghai Municipal Council, which was governing the international settlement part of Shanghai, actually wanted to clamp down. But it was actually the Japanese who, for reasons that are still somewhat fuzzy, because not many Japanese scholars have really kind of turned to this. But for reasons that are somewhat fuzzy, the Japanese allowed for the continuation of the refugees until about August of 1939. They decided also that they wanted to kind of put the kibosh on the refugee influx. With respect to the Chinese, as I said, did not really have control over Shanghai, but one should look at this in a different way, in that what is interesting in the interviews that I have done is that time and time again, people talk about with respect to their interaction with the Chinese, it was somewhat limited, but it was a time in which the Jews did not experience anti-Semitism, and that speaks volumes, especially at this time. So although the Chinese did not have the power to formally welcome the Jews, the Jews who were in Shanghai did not experience anti-Semitism from the Chinese around them.
Well, that was certainly an exception as compared to the rest of the world at that time.
Basically, all of the Jews who were in Shanghai at the end of the war eventually left. But I should say that this was again a situation where the paper walls that had prevented them to go to the other countries still were in place, and thus it was difficult, and it took a long time for the refugees to eventually leave Shanghai, but they did leave. There are, and here the Shanghai Jewish Refugees Museum in Shanghai is instrumental in recording these stories. There are instances of friendships, even romantic relationships and marriages that came about in Shanghai. Because people use the term Shanghai ghetto with respect to a period between 1943 to 1945 in which the Jews were restricted in a designated area, even though it has the term ghetto, it really isn't a ghetto in the sense that we think of it in the Holocaust. No. And they were not secluded from the Chinese population. So even within the designated area, the Jews were a tiny minority. So they were living amongst destitute Chinese. And it's interesting when you hear from the refugees, they talk about how as bad as it was for them, they realized that it was even worse for the Chinese that were among them, because the Chinese, many of them were refugees themselves, who had kind of come into the city from the countryside from the war with Japan. They were definitely treated as enemy subjects, and were beaten. And there are many of the interviews that I've had with Shanghai refugees who were children then remember seeing scenes of violence where Chinese were subjected to violence by the occupying Japanese, and that definitely has stayed with them as they remember seeing, just for tiny infractions, Chinese being beaten and even killed by Japanese soldiers. But I would say that the Shanghai Jewish Refugees Museum has done a lot to continue to preserve those friendships and to promote those friendships. And it has become not only a place of history, but also a kind of place of symbolic friendship between Jews and Chinese.
What's the most interesting and profound thing that you've learned from the many interviews that you've had with the Shanghai landers?
Oh, this comes from actually a man that I just spoke with on the phone yesterday. I interviewed him for the first time in 2017. His name is Harry Abraham. And he tested me. He tested me as an interviewer, which is very important. It was clear that he wasn't going to tell his story if I didn't pass this test. He wanted to kind of know about me. And this was really important. And what he said to me was really impactful, and has kind of, I'd say, been a very big influence in terms of my research, but also how I teach the Holocaust. And that he said that there's kind of a bad way of remembering the Holocaust and commemorating the Holocaust, and there's also a good way. And he says that quite often people lose sight of the good way. He's not that big into commemorations that do not force people to think about their own lives and about their own choices that they make. And for him, he felt that Kristallnacht is often overlooked as people kind of race to focus on the camps and Auschwitz and gas chambers and so forth. And he says, well, once you get kind of caught up in that, it becomes almost unquestioning, and you're kind of inundated with darkness and death. But he says it's important to go back to Kristallnacht and think about what were the choices that people could have made at the time within Germany, outside of Germany, meaning the United States, Great Britain. What were the things that others could have done to try to prevent this spiraling story that led to extermination camps and gas chambers? And that is something that I have always emphasized in my classes from that point on, this issue of choices. And when we learn about the Holocaust, we shouldn't be learning it as some kind of voyeuristic enterprise, but rather we should be thinking about what choices do we make in our lives when we encounter discrimination, when we encounter someone who is being, bullied, when we encounter injustice. Do we just kind of walk away? Do we just hope that it doesn't happen to us? And these were the questions that Harry had for me. It really reinforced this idea of teaching about the Holocaust, but having people not just learn about it as a historical event, but think about this is an event that shows what humanity is capable of, and we are all part of humanity. What are the choices that we are going to make in our lives